Right, let's continue our little discussion on FAB's development cycle. So to me currently, this is sort of what the model looks like, right? We have our major support through the main sets, minor support through mastery sets and armory decks, and of course the expansion slot. Now, first and foremost, we touched on this a couple of videos ago, and first off, thank you for the wonderful responses. I love long comments that I can really mull over, right? For instance, I wasn't going to do a second video to this, but because of what was brought up, it deserves more talk, right? So thank you. I just don't really know how to respond sometimes because do I paragraph back or do we do something like this? I think something like this is probably a little bit better, right? So that's why we're continuing to talk about the development cycle. But when it comes to this sort of model, so first and foremost, mastery sets, I'm throwing them in there. I want to see it continue, right? Despite the lukewarm response to Mastery Pack Guardian, I'm really hoping it's not just another product line that gets shelved by LSS because it didn't quite hit the mark that they really wanted, right? It wasn't a hit out of the park, unfortunately. I want them to, look at what was done well, what was really done badly, and just improve it, but continue with it. Because I think this system to me is still really nice. It does have its flaws, and there are some other issues that you guys did bring up when it comes to this, but we'll get into that in a second, right? So again, major support through the main set, so that's about 8 classes. We seem to be getting consistently, right? A 3-class set, a 3-class set, 2-class set, so 10 heroes overall, right? Because 3, and then usually the 2-class set features 4 heroes, hence what we're getting with Super Slam. Through our mastery set, it will obviously feature 1 class, but it does come with a decent chunk of support apparently across the board, right? So that'll probably continue. The expansion slot, again, is a mix sort of minor support. Every now and then we get specializations, but then we also do get, mechanical support for the class in general. And then armory decks being more of mechanical support. So think the max armory deck, even though it didn't really move the needle, was focused on hyperdrivers. So although it has mech cards, it is prominently there to improve hyperdrivers as the mechanologist mechanic, right? So altogether, these accumulate our new development cycle. So the question is, how has this sort of changed, and what have we lost? What have we gained? And yeah, is this still a good model going forward? So if we take a look at the life cycle of Flesh and Blood, so we've got Welcome to Rathe through to High Seas here. We've mapped down all the heroes. First and foremost, right? Adjudicator and Merchant. I will not consider them proper heroes until we get proper cards, right? So I know Merchant has the legendary from Everfest to Silver Palms, and Adjudicator does have a bunch of cards. We get a hero and we get, some novelty items along with them. But both of them are special use promos, right? So even with Merchant and Genus, his weapon is a special use promo. So to me, that's showing that LSS isn't really supporting them, unlike, for instance, Bard did launch with functional songs and Final Act, even if it's not great. Shiner, anytime we get specs, Shiner gets stuff, right? And then Thief did launch with a decent package in High Seas. So to me, even though they're the lesser touched on classes, they still have at least enough to get them on the board, as opposed to, unfortunately, Merchant and Adjudicator. Now, fingers crossed, we end up getting a Bard, Merchant, Alchemist set. That would be beautiful to see next year or the year after, hopefully next year, right? That's what I'd like to see to, again, get Merchant on the table, right? And then to improve Bard, and then Alchemist is the final class, right? Referenced in lore. But yeah, looking at this, how have we sort of progressed? So first and foremost, we can add in the supplemental sets because this is something that we should touch upon because it is something that we've lost, right? So Crucible of War occurred between Arcane Rising and Monarch, right? And it was basically a support package for every hero/class that we got currently, right? Bearing in mind that there was only one real pilot except for Ninja for each class. So overall, the supplemental set's purpose was to give us rares, commons, and majestics in support of every aspect of Flesh and Blood, right? Then we got Everfest after Tales. Now it gets a little bit more dicey because, we start to get talents introduced, but it still did a relatively good job throwing in some fun and some support for, again, every current class. I mean, the only new class at that point was Illusionist, correct? So it was still only supporting 9 classes. Then we got Dynasty, which introduced Assassin, Half-Bake, unfortunately, right? Introducing it in a supplemental set. Needed Outsiders straight away to sort of get it up and running, but then it was still not super fantastic, right? So I would say this is where the supplemental set sort of starts to drop off, right? Because at that point, we're at 10 heroes, we have a whole bunch of talents, so generally speaking, supplemental set trying to support all of play would be an immense set, right? It'd take a lot of time and effort to really balance it and make sure that, again, it works, because you don't have anything else going for it other than selling packs and making the cards desirable, because you have no play component, right? Then we got Dust Till Dawn, sort of a mixed set, right? feels like a supplemental set, but wasn't a supplemental set. But at the same time, you couldn't really play with it, and it didn't focally do anything for everyone by and large, right? It introduced us to a new Prism, a new Shadow Runeblade, Vinset, right? And then a little support for Levia and Bolton, along with, again, probably the first attempt at the expansion slot, right? So then from there, we did get the expansion slot come Bright Lights, and we've had that ever since, right? And we sort of lost the supplemental sets in favor for the expansion slot, armory decks, and now the mastery set. So them in totality sort of culminate as what we normally see through a supplemental set, right? With a little bit of leeway either way, right? Now, time-wise, we've stayed consistent. So the biggest gap here is the Monarch one, but even for the Monarch one, right, that was when we got Welcome Rathe Unlimited and Arcane Rising Unlimited. So that 9-month gap wasn't really a 9-month gap, right? But that was 9 months from Groom. And since then, 4, 3, 5. So they're all basically around the same sort of time frame. We get our sets pretty consistently. Again, the big change was instead of 2 main sets and a supplemental set, we now get 3 main sets. So after that, we can throw in our supplemental products, our armory decks, right? Starting off from after heavy hitters. And this does really help smooth out, right, sort of the hero progression, or at least giving us things to tide us over. So for instance, take Mechanologist. We had Dash, Arcane Rising, then Bright Lights, and then nothing, but we've gotten some support through the armory decks, and then Puffin in High Seas. But the big issue is probably this, right? The time between when a class gets retouched upon and how that class gets retouched on. Because one of the big things that was brought up was the fact that what we are getting nowadays isn't really in support of the class, so to speak, right? There's some sense of spillover cards, some sense of support, but we are getting highly talented, highly focused sets that don't necessarily do anything for the class in its entirety. So, for instance, we can zero in on Ranger, right? So we had Riptide, Azalea, last touched upon in Outsiders. We had the Azalea Armory deck. It was okay. It was one of the first Armory decks, so I wouldn't say it was, super substantial, but it was cool, right? And then for High Seas, we got Marlin. So that was quite the wait to get a new set focused on Ranger. But Marlin being Marlin doesn't have a whole lot of crossover. So despite High Seas, not being a talented set, it is basically a talented set because we got the dual class cards of Pirate X, right? That essentially limit their use to just the new hero. So we waited a decent chunk of time to get a new Ranger focused set. And what we got didn't really help for Azalea or Riptide in probably the sense that people wanted, right? So Flesh and Blood has sort of moved away from pick your favorite class to play in main, and eventually you'll get support, your hero goes, you'll get someone new to stand in, to more so pick your hero, and every now and then you'll get some new stuff, right? So for instance, with High Seas, your option is to swap to Marlin, or basically use what Riptide has currently access to. Because again, there is some cool crossover stuff in maybe the commons and rares, but by and large, all the really impactful, powerful stuff doesn't necessarily equate to anything useful for the older heroes, right, within the class pool. So it's that sort of weight that is the issue, because for me personally, we've sped up the development cycle, right? These big gaps between focusing on a class in some fashion have become smaller and smaller if we throw in the armory decks and now the mastery set. So that time frame to cycle around is shorter, but what we're getting out of it isn't quite as significant. So for instance, if we look at the sets that have talents, we had Welcome Rathe, Arcane Rising, no talents. Then we had a string of Monarch, Tails, and Uprising. Then Outsiders with no talents, Dusk Till Dawn, talented, Bright Lights, Heavy Hitters, no talent. But currently we are in another string of talented sets. It looks like this is going to continue, right? So we had Mystic, Part Mistveil, we had Earth and Lightning, Rosetta, we had Draconic and Hunted, we had Pyrus, right? Technically, we will count it as talent because in one way or the other, it restricted a decent chunk of the cards to, again, the new heroes. And then we're going Monarch 3 in start of next year, right? And probably following that, another Tails set. I can't remember. Correct me, but the Aurora is not an armory deck. It's coming in some other fashion, maybe mastery product, maybe something else, but it might be connected to the second set of the year, which means, again, we're getting this whole block of talented. Now, from LSS's perspective, this is probably the correct thing to do in terms of business, right? Because it means every set has relevancy. Every set has something new that if you want to jump on board, you need everything from that set, rather than it being a few fringe cards, right? Well, at the bare minimum, a third of the set, so to speak, that help with the hero you are currently playing. So I can understand why they're doing it, but now I can also understand the rationale that this model doesn't really help with how long it takes to get back to X hero, right? because although, again, we're getting back to X class, we're not getting anything significant for them, despite, again, having the higher product range and the shorter cycle between doing just that, right? So with that in mind, going back to our development cycle, yes, we have major sport through our 3 main sets a year. Yes, they touch on 8 classes, which is more than half, right? What do we get to? We got to 16 in total, but then we take out Merchant, Bard, Thief, Shapeshifter, so we're probably down to 12, right? So again, within 4 sets, they could technically sort of cycle around every class, but again, it's not directly supporting anyone. So although we got Warrior and the Hunted, for instance, it was Draconic Dagger support, right? So either you try the new Dagger stuff in the old Warriors, which, didn't really mesh well, or you play Fang, since he is built around daggers, right? So they have the ability to cycle around quicker, but the fact that we're getting specialized sets is sort of the issue, right? And then minor sport and mastery sets, unfortunately what we got is basically just Velda-centric. So even though it is Soul Guardian, it doesn't really do a huge amount, right? Granted, there's some stuff there for Victor, nothing for Betsy. I'm sure Bravo can get some use out of it, but generally speaking, right, he's on the lower echelon for heroes. So even with the mastery set, it's not minor support for the class, it's minor support for X hero, and sort of just feels like the next step up from the armory deck. So then that leaves the armory decks themselves in the expansion slot. So again, the mechanical support in the armory deck is nice, but it can be hit or miss. Again, we got some great stuff for hyperdrivers for Max, or maybe hyperdrivers for just Mechanologist. But again, it was not good enough. So it just falls flat. Same can be sort of said for the expansion slot. We are trying to get more impactful cards, but LSS really have to get the card right, because unlike supplemental sets, right, where we used to get a yearly boost of all rarities, we now, again, focusing on the expansion slot, armory decks, and spillover cards, where we're getting a handful of rares and probably majestics for X class X hero. So it's a less is more approach, but unfortunately because of that, everything has to really succeed, right? If the card is slightly undertuned, it doesn't matter. It becomes irrelevant, right? And unfortunately, we are getting quite a few of those cards every expansion slot cycle, every armory deck cycle, right? Where things just miss the mark because, power in a vacuum, so to speak, right? Because the testing for LSS can't be everything in play. It is usually a little bit more fringe, just what mechanically works for that hero in probably an uncontested fashion, when it should really be, if it's up against every form of disruption, how does it fare, right? Because that's sort of the big issue. So although, again, the current model cycles through everything quicker, it's less impactful because of how it's designed, which is also a weird thing, because it means it is open to the possibility of great change. But I suppose the question to leave on is, do you like what we're currently getting more than supplemental sets? Would you rather give up a set for a supplemental set? I think the best outcome maybe would be, can the mastery and go back to a supplemental set. But again, a supplemental set would take a lot of thought to make sure it is relevant and impactful. But it is nice in the sense that it does come with a whole bigger chunk of cards. Now, it's another question of, again, do they support every class? Because we are getting to the point where there are a ton of classes, and, a supplemental set, rather than being smaller, would probably have to be 1.5 times the size of a standard set to do what it needs to do. And again, you'd still have the cards that fall away. I mean, it would be great for introducing new mechanics, because again, you have the commons, rares, and majestics to play with. But at the same time, how it's being handled in the armory decks is kind of alright, but maybe the armory decks themselves need a larger cohort of new cards, again, in those lower rarities to help smooth things over. But yeah, that's my thoughts, right? I do like the fact that we're cycling through things quicker, but I can completely understand how it is kind of hit and miss, right? And again, how we sort of moved away from your class to specifically your hero, right? Because even within X heroes, the amount of crossover cards isn't highly significant, right? You have classes like Assassin, where basically, as long as it's just stealth, there is a great deal of crossover between lists, but then you have other classes like, for instance, Guardian. So Victor with Clash, Betsy with Wager, and then Velda with Seismic Surges. So even within Guardian, there's a tendency for cards to be a bit more specialized, right? And that's sort of the unfortunate nature with the horizontal growth of Flesh and Blood. But hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think. Yeah.